The heavy thud of black trash bags hitting the frozen pavement marked the worst moment of my life. My name is Meredith, and I'm 25 years old. My sister Jenna stood in the open doorway with a look of pure triumph on her face, while she pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a dirty thief who had stolen her expensive luxury watch to sell for quick cash. I tried to protest my innocence to them, but my father stepped out just long enough to throw the last of my boxes onto the driveway with unnecessary force. He looked at me with cold eyes before he slammed the heavy front door shut right in my face, after declaring that he was done housing a criminal. I desperately looked up toward the living room window hoping for any sign of mercy, but my mother just watched me from behind the glass like a stone statue. She stared down at her injured daughter shivering in the freezing Colorado snow without showing a single trace of emotion or maternal instinct despite my recently broken leg. I sat paralyzed on the icy concrete surrounded by my scattered clothes, while the realization hit me that my entire family had united to destroy me over a despicable lie. They truly believed I was helpless enough to just roll over and disappear from their lives forever without a fight. However, they were about to find out that they had messed with the wrong woman, because I was not going to let them get away with this. If you want to see how I survived this nightmare and drag them all to court to make them pay for what they did. For 5 long years I lived not for my own dreams, but as a tireless money-printing machine that functioned solely to keep my family afloat. My early 20s were spent juggling 2 demanding jobs to ensure every single utility bill was paid on time, while also clearing the credit card debt Jenna accumulated from her impulsive shopping sprees. I never once complained about the exhaustion because I believed that supporting the family was my duty as a daughter. I foolishly thought that my sacrifice was building a foundation of mutual love and respect that would support me if I ever needed help in return. That illusion of security shattered into pieces 5 months ago when a heavy pallet at the logistics warehouse collapsed directly onto me during a shift. The resulting spinal injury required immediate surgery and left me completely unable to walk or work during the long and painful recovery process. My income vanished overnight, which meant the steady stream of cash that my parents and Jenna relied upon suddenly dried up. The transition from being the golden child who paid for everything to a patient who needed care was jarring and immediate. During the first month of my recovery, my parents covered my medical expenses with visible reluctance and constant complaints about how expensive the physical therapy sessions were becoming. My mother often sighed loudly while writing checks for my medication, making sure I knew exactly how much of a burden my broken body was placing on their retirement savings. I tried to apologize for the accident, but my father would just shake his head and walk away without offering a single word of comfort. They acted as if I had chosen to get crushed by that pallet just to inconvenience them. By the time we reached the 5th month, my personal savings had completely evaporated and their attitude shifted from passive annoyance to open hostility. I remember the humiliation I felt last Tuesday when I had to ask my father for $50 to refill my pain prescription. He looked at me with genuine disgust before throwing a crumpled bill onto the coffee table like I was a beggar on the street. That small act of cruelty made me realize that their love for me was entirely conditional on my ability to provide for them. Family dinners devolved into excruciating torture sessions where Jenna would poke at my injury with sharp words disguised as casual conversation. She frequently made loud comments about how nice it must be to sit around the house all day doing nothing while everyone else worked hard. Jenna seemed to forget that I had paid for the very food she was eating and the clothes on her back for half a decade. One evening, she looked right at me across the table and called me a useless parasite who was draining the life out of our parents. My mother did not scold her for the insult, but simply continued eating her meal as if she agreed with every word Jenna said. The isolation became unbearable because I was trapped in a house where everyone wished I would just disappear. The only person I could safely talk to was my best friend Heidi, who listened patiently while I cried about the unfair treatment over the phone. Heidi was furious on my behalf and offered to let me crash at her place, but I hesitated because her apartment was small and not wheelchair accessible. I told Heidi that things were bad, but insisted my family would never actually throw me out on the street because we were blood relatives. I clung to the desperate hope that this was just a phase caused by stress and that they would eventually remember how much I had done for them. Heidi warned me that their behavior was escalating dangerously, but I was too afraid to accept the reality that my family viewed me as an expired asset. I spent my days trying to stay out of their way, making myself as small as possible to avoid triggering another outburst from Jenna or a lecture from my father. I did not know that while I was trying to heal and keep the peace, they were already plotting a way to permanently remove the burden I had become. My loyalty kept me blind to the fact that for my parents and Jenna, I was only valuable when I was writing checks. 3 days after the intense argument about my medication costs, a perfectly orchestrated performance was staged early on Saturday morning. I was abruptly awakened from a restless sleep by the shrill sound of Jenna screaming downstairs about how her valuable jewelry had mysteriously vanished from her dresser. Before I could even sit up or process what was happening, my bedroom door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Jenna stood there with a face twisted in mock outrage while accusing me of stealing her luxury watch to sell it on the black market for quick cash. She claimed that my desperation for pain medication had turned me into a common criminal who preyed on her own family. My mother immediately stepped into the room with a grim determination that suggested she had practiced this exact moment in front of a mirror. She announced that she would conduct a thorough search of my personal space to prove my innocence or guilt once and for all. I watched in horror as she bypassed my closet and desk completely to head straight for my bed with terrifying precision. She ruthlessly tore the blankets off my injured body and ripped the mattress up from the box spring with surprising strength. There, nestled precisely in the center of the bed frame, where I could never have reached on my own, lay the gold watch. The air left my lungs as Jenna pointed at the planted evidence with a theatrical gasp that would have made a soap opera actress proud. She leaned down until her face was inches from mine and screamed the lines she had likely rehearsed all morning. I knew it. You were desperate for cash, so you stole it. You are nothing but a dirty thief. I tried to stammer out a defense to explain that I could barely walk, let alone sneak into her room, but my father appeared in the doorway to deliver the final verdict. He did not ask for my side of the story or question how a cripple could execute a burglary without being heard. Instead, he marched over to my nightstand and snatched up my smartphone and the house keys that were resting beside my water glass. He coldly declared that he was confiscating my property to sell them as partial reimbursement for the money I had supposedly stolen from the family resources. The next 20 minutes were a blur of physical and emotional violence as they grabbed black trash bags and began indiscriminately stuffing my clothes inside. My mother cleared out my dresser drawers by simply dumping them upside down, while my father dragged me toward the front door. I pleaded with them to stop because my back was screaming in agony with every rough movement they inflicted upon me. They ignored my tears and shoved me out onto the icy concrete of the driveway before throwing the bags of clothes after me like I was garbage. The heavy front door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the freezing Colorado air, followed immediately by the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. I was left shivering in my thin pajamas without a phone money or a way to contact anyone for help. I sat there for what felt like hours while the biting cold seeped into my bones and made my injury throb with excruciating intensity. I was terrified that I would freeze to death on the very driveway I had paid to have paved just 2 years prior. Salvation arrived in the form of Heidi's silver sedan turning the corner as she had planned to come over that morning to bring me a coffee. She slammed on her brakes the moment she saw me huddled among the trash bags and rushed out to help me into the heated passenger seat. When I told her through chattering teeth what had happened, her expression shifted from shock to a dangerous kind of fury. She helped me load my meager belongings into her trunk and stated that we were leaving this toxic city immediately. We drove straight onto the highway to head toward the home of my Aunt Sarah, who lived in a quiet town in the neighboring state. 2 weeks passed since the night I was kicked out, and I was slowly recovering my health in the peaceful home of Aunt Sarah. The atmosphere in her cozy house in Kansas was a stark contrast to the cold hostility I had endured for so long in Colorado. My Aunt Sarah treated me with a level of tenderness that I had forgotten, existed carefully changing my bandages and preparing nutritious meals to help my body heal from the trauma of the eviction. She sat across from me at her kitchen table one evening and listened in stunned silence as I recounted the horrific details of the watch accusation and my subsequent expulsion from the family home. When I finished describing how my father had thrown me into the snow, she slammed her hand down on the mahogany table with such force that the porcelain teacups rattled in their saucers. She took a deep breath to compose herself before looking at me with a serious expression that told me she was about to reveal something of immense importance. Aunt Sarah explained that my grandfather had always suspected that his son, my father, was terrible with money and easily manipulated by greed. Because of this deep-seated mistrust, he had secretly established a significant trust fund solely for my benefit before he passed away years ago. I was completely speechless when she revealed that the account contained exactly $750,000, which was intended to ensure I would always have a safety net. The revelation that I had nearly $1 million sitting in a bank account was overwhelming because it meant I could finally afford the spinal surgery I so desperately needed. A wave of relief washed over me for the first time in months because I realized I would not be crippled forever and could rebuild my life independently. We wasted no time and immediately called the bank that managed the trust fund to authorize the transfer of funds for my medical procedure. I sat there with the phone pressed tightly to my ear while imagining how good it would feel to walk without pain again. However, the silence on the other end of the line stretched on for an agonizingly long time before the bank representative returned with a confused tone in her voice. She informed me that the account balance was currently zero because the entire sum had been withdrawn via a cashier's check just a few days prior. I felt the blood drain from my face as she read out the date of the transaction, which was exactly 3 days after my parents had thrown me out of the house. The timeline was too perfect to be a coincidence because they had waited until I was physically removed from the premises to execute their plan. Aunt Sarah was incandescent with rage and immediately reached out to a legal professional she trusted implicitly to handle such a delicate and criminal matter. My lawyer, Mr. Vance, arrived at the house later that afternoon carrying a briefcase and an air of serious professionalism that commanded respect. We provided him with all the details of the eviction and the subsequent discovery of the empty bank account so he could begin his preliminary investigation. He made several calls to the bank's fraud department and requested digital copies of the withdrawal documents to be sent over for immediate review. When the images of the cashed check finally appeared on his laptop screen, the three of us gathered around to examine the evidence of this betrayal. The check was made out to my parents' joint account, and on the signature line was a scrawl that looked remarkably like my own handwriting but lacked the characteristic loop I always added to the letter M. It was a forgery that was good enough to pass a casual inspection by a bank teller, but clearly not my own handiwork. The realization that my parents had not only kicked me out, but had also committed a felony to steal my grandfather's legacy was physically nauseating. Mr. Vance adjusted his glasses as he looked from the computer screen to where I was sitting in my wheelchair. He explained that by kicking me out and confiscating my keys and phone, they had ensured I would not receive any bank alerts or mail notifications regarding the transaction. They had effectively isolated me from the world just long enough to steal $750,000 without my knowledge. He leaned forward and spoke with a gravity that chilled me to the bone. They planned this for a long time, Meredith. Kicking you out was just the final step to legitimize the theft. 1 week after discovering the blatant theft of my inheritance, the living room of Aunt Sarah's house was transformed into a strategic investigation center filled with stacks of legal documents. Mr. Vance had worked tirelessly to obtain detailed transaction records from the bank that exposed exactly where every cent of the $750,000 had gone. We sat around the mahogany coffee table in stunned silence as we traced the digital footprint of the money that was supposed to secure my future, but was instead funding their greed. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable, because it showed a direct wire transfer from the trust fund into a joint account owned by my parents on the very same day the forged check was cashed. The bank statements painted a truly disgusting picture of how quickly they had burned through a significant portion of the money in just a few short weeks. A massive chunk of the funds had been used to pay off high-interest loans that my father had secretly accumulated through years of terrible investment decisions and reckless gambling debts. It was infuriating to see my grandfather's hard-earned legacy being used to clean up the financial mess that my father had created through his own incompetence and arrogance. They had essentially stolen my safety net to patch the holes in their own sinking ship without a second thought for my physical well-being or recovery. However, the most infuriating discovery was a recent transaction for $80,000 to a local luxury car dealership that was dated just yesterday. We quickly checked Jenna's social media profiles and found a fresh photo of her posing triumphantly next to a brand new red sports car with a caption about how hard work pays off. The audacity of her bragging about a vehicle bought with stolen money while I was struggling to pay for spinal surgery made my blood boil with a rage I had never felt before. It was the final proof we needed that the entire family was complicit in the theft and was actively enjoying the fruits of their crime without a shred of guilt. Mr. Vance looked up from the stack of papers with a contemplative expression and suggested that while the paper trail was strong, we needed something more concrete to ensure a total victory in court. He proposed a bold and risky plan that involved me returning to the house to confront them directly while wearing a hidden recording device. The goal was to trick them into verbally admitting that they had forged my signature and engineered my eviction specifically to access the money. A recorded confession would be the final nail in the coffin that would make it impossible for their defense attorneys to claim the withdrawal was a misunderstanding or an authorized transaction. The mere thought of walking back into that house and facing the people who had discarded me like trash made my stomach churn with intense anxiety. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me because I was terrified that they might hurt me again, or that I would crumble under their emotional abuse. I started to shake uncontrollably as I imagined Jenna's cruel laughter and my father's cold glare, wondering if I really had the inner strength to pull off such a deception. My Aunt Sarah noticed my trembling hands and reached across the table to hold them firmly in her own warm grasp to steady me. She looked me directly in the eyes with a fierce determination that gave me the courage I desperately needed in that moment of weakness. "You have to do this to get justice for yourself, Meredith." Her words resonated deep within me because I knew she was right, and that hiding away would only let them win by default. I took a deep breath to steady my fraying nerves and agreed to the plan because I refused to let them destroy my life without a fight. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing a high-quality digital recorder that could be sewn into the lining of my jacket so it would be completely invisible to the naked eye. Mr. Vance coached me on exactly what to say to trigger their arrogance and make them feel safe enough to brag about their crimes. I practiced my lines over and over again until I could deliver them with the perfect mix of pathetic desperation and submission to ensure they would lower their guard. I knew that tomorrow I would have to give the performance of a lifetime if I wanted to reclaim what was rightfully mine. That weekend, Mr. Vance's car parked quietly behind the block to remain unseen as I adjusted my crutches and began the slow, painful walk toward the old house. I deliberately allowed my shoulders to slump forward and dragged my injured leg more heavily than necessary to project an image of utter defeat. I knew that the only way to get them to lower their guard was to appeal to their massive egos by appearing completely broken and desperate for their help. My heart was pounding against my ribs with such intensity that I feared they might hear it through the thick winter coat that concealed the recording device sewn into the lining. I took a deep, trembling breath to center myself before knocking timidly on the front door that had been slammed in my face just weeks ago. When my father opened the door, a look of smug satisfaction instantly spread across his face as he took in my disheveled appearance and tear-stained cheeks. He stepped aside to let me limp into the hallway without offering a hand, clearly enjoying the sight of his daughter crawling back to beg for scraps. I shuffled into the living room where my mother and Jenna were lounging comfortably on the sofa while watching television. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately from casual relaxation to thick tension as three pairs of eyes locked onto me with predatory amusement. I lowered my head and stammered out a rehearsed plea about running out of money and having nowhere else to go in the freezing cold. My mother looked down at me from her armchair with a sneer of absolute contempt before taking a slow sip of her tea. She told me that I should have thought about the consequences before I decided to become a thief and a burden on the family. I swallowed my pride and whispered that I just needed money for surgery because I knew about the trust fund my grandfather had left me. The mention of the money caused a spark of anger in her eyes, and she leaned forward to deliver the exact words I had been praying to hear. Grandpa's money was always family money anyway, so I just helped you spend it since you are clearly too useless to manage it yourself. I kept my head down to hide the spark of triumph in my eyes while I let the silence stretch out to encourage them to keep talking. Jenna could not resist the opportunity to kick me while I was down, so she chimed in with a cruel giggle that made my stomach turn. She stood up and walked over to where I was standing to inspect my worn-out clothes with a look of mock pity. Jenna leaned in close to my ear and decided to twist the knife further by revealing the truth about the incident that had started this entire nightmare. "Did you really think I lost that watch? You are so naive, little sister." The recording device against my chest felt heavy with the weight of their confessions, and I knew instantly that I had everything I needed to destroy them. The transformation that came over me in that moment was immediate and terrifying to them because I stopped hunching over and straightened my spine to my full height. The look of pathetic desperation vanished from my face to be replaced by a cold, hard stare that silenced their laughter instantly. I reached into my coat pocket to pull out the small receiver and held it up so they could see the red light that had been blinking the entire time. I spoke clearly and calmly to inform them that every single word they had just said was recorded and would be played for a judge. The color drained from my mother's face as the realization of what she had just admitted to crashed down on her. Before they could react or try to grab the device from me, the front door opened with a decisive click behind me. Mr. Vance stepped into the entryway wearing a sharp suit and carrying a thick legal file that looked like a weapon in his hands. He walked past my stunned father and slammed a stack of subpoenas onto the coffee table with a loud thud that made Jenna jump. The three of them stood frozen in a state of absolute panic as Mr. Vance informed them that they were being sued for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. My father tried to stammer out a denial, but the words died in his throat when he looked at the recorder still clutched in my hand. I did not say another word to them because there was nothing left to say to people who would steal from their own blood. I turned around and walked out of that house for the final time, leaving them drowning in the consequences of their own greed. A few weeks later, the corridor of the county courthouse was flooded with sunlight, but the atmosphere between the parties was as cold as ice. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table next to Mr. Vance, while my heart hammered against my ribs in a rhythm of nervous anticipation. Across the aisle, my parents and Jenna sat stiffly in their Sunday best, trying desperately to project the image of a respectable and loving family that was being unfairly targeted. However, Their facade of confidence began to crumble the moment the bailiff called the court to order and the proceedings officially commenced. Mr. Vance wasted no time in dismantling their defense with a methodical precision that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring to watch. He started by projecting the bank statements onto the large screen for the judge and jury to see, highlighting the exact moment the $750,000 left the trust fund. The timeline was undeniable because the withdrawal occurred just 72 hours after I had been forcibly removed from the property. He then called a handwriting expert to the stand, who testified with 100% certainty that the signature on the cashier's check was a clumsy forgery. The expert pointed out specific inconsistencies in the loop of the letters that proved without a shadow of a doubt that I had not signed that document. However, the courtroom truly fell into a stunned silence when Mr. Vance played the audio recording that I had captured during my visit to the house. My mother's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, admitting that she viewed the money as family property that she had a right to take. Then came Jenna's mocking laughter and her confession that the missing watch was nothing more than a convenient lie to justify kicking me out. The members of the jury looked from the speakers to the defendants with expressions of open disgust and disbelief. My parents stared down at the table in humiliation, while Jenna turned a bright shade of red as she realized her own arrogance had been her undoing. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, peered over her glasses at my family with a look of profound disappointment that made them squirm in their seats. She leaned forward to question them directly about how they could justify evicting a daughter who was recovering from a severe spinal injury just to access a bank account. My parents' defense attorney tried to raise an objection to protect his clients, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand because she wanted to hear the answer from them. She asked them if they understood that financial elder abuse and fraud were serious crimes that carried not just financial penalties, but potential prison sentences. The mention of prison time acted like a catalyst that instantly shattered the fragile alliance that had held my family together up until this point. The realization that they were facing real consequences caused the panic in the room to spike to a fever pitch. Jenna looked frantically between her lawyer and the judge before her self-preservation instinct completely took over. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back, and pointed a trembling finger directly at my mother while screaming at the top of her lungs. "Mom told me to do it. She said I needed a new car, so we had to kick her out." The courtroom erupted into murmurs of shock as Jenna threw her own mother under the bus to save herself from a criminal record. My mother's jaw dropped in disbelief before her face twisted into a mask of pure rage at the betrayal. She abandoned all decorum and turned on her husband, desperate to shift the blame away from herself before the judge could make a ruling. "I am not going to jail for this. It was your father's idea because he owes money all over town for his gambling debts." My father turned a shade of purple as he realized his wife was exposing his deepest financial secrets to the entire court just to save her own skin. He stood up to defend himself, shouting over the noise that he had only borrowed the money to save the family from ruin because his wife and daughter spent money faster than he could earn it. It was a pathetic display of selfishness as they tore each other apart, proving that their loyalty to one another was as shallow as their love for me. The judge had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order as the bailiffs moved in to ensure the argument did not turn physical. I watched the chaos unfold with a strange sense of detachment, realizing that I was finally seeing them for exactly who they were. They were not a family unit, but a group of parasites who would consume each other the moment their host was no longer available. The judge finally brought the room to silence and delivered her verdict with a tone of absolute finality that brooked no argument. She ruled completely in my favor, stating that the evidence of fraud and malicious intent was overwhelming and undeniable. The court ordered my parents and Jenna to immediately restitute the full sum of $750,000 to the trust fund. In addition to the principal amount, they were ordered to pay significant interest calculated from the date of theft, as well as all of my legal fees and punitive damages for emotional distress. The judge also declared that she was referring the case to the district attorney's office for review regarding criminal charges for forgery and fraud. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding as Mr. Vance squeezed my shoulder in congratulation. Justice had been served, and the people who tried to destroy me were now left with nothing but their debt and their hatred for each other. The court's final decision swept through what remained of my so-called family like a massive hurricane that leaves nothing but scattered debris in its wake. The judgment required immediate payment of the stolen funds, plus damages, which meant my parents had absolutely no choice but to put our childhood home on the market to liquidate their only significant asset. The sale was rushed and humiliating for my father, who had always defined his personal worth by his property ownership, but it was the only legal way to satisfy the court order. They are now living in a cramped, rundown apartment in a less desirable part of town, because that is all they can afford after paying back every cent of the stolen money and the exorbitant legal fees. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that my mother has been forced to take a job, cleaning houses for wealthy families while my father is currently bagging groceries at the local supermarket to make ends meet in his retirement years. Jenna's life imploded even more spectacularly because the criminal conviction for financial fraud effectively ended her career prospects in any respectable corporate environment. She was fired from her job immediately after the verdict became public record, and she soon discovered that no reputable company would hire a known thief to handle their business. The sister who used to mock me for working hard to pay her bills is now waiting tables at a roadside diner just to generate enough tips to pay rent for a small room she shares with strangers. She had to sell the red sports car at a significant loss to pay her share of the damages, leaving her with absolutely nothing to show for her treachery, except a permanent criminal record. While their lives were falling apart under the weight of their own choices, mine was finally beginning to come together in the peaceful way I had always dreamed. I used a portion of the recovered funds to pay for the best spinal surgeon in the state, who performed a complex procedure that completely restored my ability to walk without pain. The overwhelming feeling of taking my first unassisted steps in the hospital corridor was a victory sweeter than any courtroom win because it signified my true physical and emotional independence. I purchased a lovely, modest apartment just a few blocks away from Aunt Sarah, so I could be close to the one person who stood by me when my entire world collapsed. The silence from my end has been absolute, because I blocked every single phone number and social media profile associated with my parents and sister to ensure they could never reach me again. They tried to reach out a few times through distant relatives to ask for family assistance when their bills started piling up, but I refused to even entertain their messages or acknowledge their existence. I have realized that maintaining my peace requires a fortress of solitude where they can no longer reach me to inflict fresh wounds or manipulate my emotions. I sleep soundly at night, knowing that I am safe from their schemes and that I owe them absolutely nothing but the silence they earned. This painful journey has taught me several profound lessons that will guide me for the rest of my life as I build my new future. I have learned that the word family is often used as a weapon to manipulate us, but true family is defined by how people treat you when you have nothing to offer them. We must understand that sharing blood with someone does not give them a lifetime pass to abuse, exploit, or betray us without facing any consequences. Another crucial realization is that financial independence is the only true shield we have against the unpredictability of life and the cruelty of those who claim to love us. Finally, I discovered that forgiveness is not a requirement for healing, and sometimes the healthiest choice is to simply walk away and never look back. We are often told to forgive and forget, but real happiness comes from removing the toxic elements from our lives entirely, so we can grow without being poisoned by their presence. Thank you so much for listening to my story and walking this difficult road with me until the very end. I am curious to know what you would have done if you found yourself in my position, so please share your honest thoughts and opinions in the comments section below.